Chapter 1, Part 3 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6. Character of the Government. In discussing the effects upon the development of a nation's sea power exerted by its government and institutions, it will be necessary to avoid a tendency to over-philosophizing, to confine attention to obvious and immediate causes and their plain results, without prying too far beneath the surface for remote and ultimate influences. Nevertheless, it must be noted that particular forms of government with their accompanying institutions and the character of rulers at one time or another have exercised a very marked influence upon the development of sea power. The various traits of a country and its people, which have so far been considered, constitute the natural characteristics with which a nation, like a man, begins its career. The conduct of the government, in turn, corresponds to the exercise of the intelligent will power, which, according as it is wise, energetic, and persevering, or the reverse, causes success or failure in a man's life or a nation's history. It would seem probable that a government in full accord with the natural bias of its people would most successfully advance its growth in every respect, and in the matter of sea power the most brilliant successes have followed where there has been intelligent direction by a government fully imbued with the spirit of the people and conscious of its true general bent. Such a government is most certainly secured when the will of the people, or of their best natural exponents, has some large share in making it. But such free governments have sometimes fallen short, while, on the other hand, despotic power, wielded with judgment and consistency, has created at times a great sea commerce and a brilliant navy with greater directness than can be reached by the slower processes of a free people. The difficulty in the latter case is to ensure perseverance after the death of a particular despot. England, having undoubtedly reached the greatest height of sea power of any modern nation, the action of her government first claims attention. In general direction, this action has been consistent, though often far from praiseworthy. It has aimed steadily at the control of the sea. One of its most arrogant expressions dates back as far as the reign of James I, when she had scarce any possessions outside her own islands, before Virginia or Massachusetts was settled. Here is Richelieu's account of it. The Duke of Sully, minister of Henry IV., one of the most chivalrous princes that ever lived, having embarked at Calais in a French ship wearing the French flag at the main, was no sooner in the Channel than, meeting an English despatch boat which was there to receive him, the commander of the latter ordered the French ship to lower her flag. The Duke, considering that his quality freed him from such an affront, boldly refused. But this refusal was followed by 3 cannon shot, which, piercing his ship, pierced the heart likewise of all good Frenchmen. Might forced him to yield what right forbade, and for all the complaints he made, he could get no better reply from the English captain than this: that just as his duty obliged him to honor the ambassador's rank, it also obliged him to exact the honor due to the flag of his master as sovereign of the sea. If the words of King James himself were more polite, they nevertheless had no other effect than to compel the Duke to take counsel of his prudence, feigning to be satisfied, while his wound was all the time smarting and incurable. Henry the Great had to practise moderation on this occasion, but with the resolve another time to sustain the rights of his crown by the force that, with the aid of time, he should be able to put upon the sea. This act of unpardonable insolence, according to modern ideas, was not so much out of accord with the spirit of nations in that day. It is chiefly noteworthy as the most striking as well as one of the earliest indications of the purpose of England to assert herself at all risks upon the sea; and the insult was offered under one of her most timid kings to an ambassador immediately representing the bravest and ablest of French sovereigns. This empty honor of the flag, a claim insignificant except as the outward manifestation of the purpose of a government, was as rigidly exacted under Cromwell as under the kings. It was one of the conditions of peace yielded by the Dutch after their disastrous war of 1654. Cromwell, a despot in everything but name, was keenly alive to all that concerned England's honor and strength, and did not stop at barren salutes to promote them. Hardly yet possessed of power, the English navy sprang rapidly into a new life and vigor under his stern rule. England's rights, or reparation for her wrongs, were demanded by her fleets throughout the world, in the Baltic, in the Mediterranean, against the Barbary States, in the West Indies; and under him the conquest of Jamaica began that extension of her empire by force of arms which has gone on to our own days. Nor were equally strong peaceful measures for the growth of English trade and shipping forgotten. Cromwell's celebrated Navigation Act declared that all imports into England or her colonies must be conveyed exclusively in vessels belonging to England herself, or to the country in which the products carried were grown or manufactured. This decree, aimed specially at the Dutch, the common carriers of Europe, was resented throughout the commercial world; but the benefit to England in those days of national strife and animosity was so apparent that it lasted long under the monarchy. A century and a quarter later we find Nelson, before his famous career had begun, showing his zeal for the welfare of England's shipping by enforcing this same act in the West Indies against American merchant ships. When Cromwell was dead and Charles II sat on the throne of his father, this king, false to the English people, was yet true to England's greatness and to the traditional policy of her government on the sea. In his treacherous intrigues with Louis XIV., by which he aimed to make himself independent of Parliament and people, he wrote to Louis: "There are two impediments to a perfect union. The first is the great care France is now taking to create a commerce and to be an imposing maritime power. This is so great a cause of suspicion with us, who can possess importance only by our commerce and our naval force, that every step which France takes in this direction will perpetuate the jealousy between the two nations." In the midst of the negotiations which preceded the detestable attack of the two kings upon the Dutch Republic, a warm dispute arose as to who should command the united fleets of France and England. Charles was inflexible on this point. "It is the custom of the English," said he, "to command at sea." And he told the French ambassador plainly that, were he to yield, his subjects would not obey him. In the projected partition of the United Provinces, he reserved for England the maritime plunder in positions that controlled the mouths of the rivers Scheldt and Meuse. The navy under Charles preserved for some time the spirit and discipline impressed on it by Cromwell's iron rule, though later it shared in the general decay of morale which marked this evil reign. Monk, having by a great strategic blunder sent off a fourth of his fleet, found himself in 1666 in presence of a greatly superior Dutch force. Disregarding the odds, he attacked without hesitation, and for 3 days maintained the fight with honor, though with loss. Such conduct is not war, but in the single eye that looked to England's naval prestige and dictated his action, common as it was to England's people as well as to her government, has lain the secret of final success, following many blunders through the centuries. Charles's successor, James II., was himself a seaman, and had commanded in two great sea fights. When William III. Came to the throne, the governments of England and Holland were under one hand, and continued united in one purpose against Louis XIV. Until the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, that is, for a quarter of a century. The English government, more and more steadily and with conscious purpose, pushed on the extension of her sea dominion and fostered the growth of her sea power. While, as an open enemy, she struck at France upon the sea, so as an artful friend, many at least believed, she sapped the power of Holland afloat. The treaty between the two countries provided that of the sea forces Holland should furnish 3/8, England 5/8, or nearly double. Such a provision, coupled with a further one which made Holland keep up an army of 102,000 against England's 40,000, virtually threw the land war on one and the sea war on the other. The tendency, whether designed or not, is evident, and at the peace, while Holland received compensation by land, England obtained, besides commercial privileges in France, Spain, and the Spanish West Indies, the important maritime concessions of Gibraltar and Port Mahon in the Mediterranean, of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Hudson's Bay in North America. The naval power of France and Spain had disappeared; that of Holland thenceforth steadily declined. Posted thus in America, the West Indies, and the Mediterranean, the English government thenceforth moved firmly forward on the path which made of the English kingdom the British Empire. For the 25 years following the Peace of Utrecht, peace was the chief aim of the ministers who directed the policy of the two great seaboard nations, France and England. But amid all the fluctuations of continental politics, in a most unsettled period, abounding in petty wars and shifty treaties, the eye of England was steadily fixed on the maintenance of her sea power. In the Baltic, her fleets checked the attempts of Peter the Great upon Sweden, and so maintained a balance of power in that sea, from which she drew not only a great trade, but the chief part of her naval stores, and which the Czar aimed to make a Russian lake. Denmark endeavored to establish an East India Company aided by foreign capital. England and Holland not only forbade their subjects to join it, but threatened Denmark, and thus stopped an enterprise they thought adverse to their sea interests. In the Netherlands, which by the Utrecht Treaty had passed to Austria, a similar East India Company, having Ostend for its port, was formed with the emperor's sanction. This step, meant to restore to the Low Countries the trade lost to them through their natural outlet of the Scheldt, was opposed by the sea powers England and Holland; and their greediness for the monopoly of trade, helped in this instance by France, stifled this company also, after a few years of struggling life. In the Mediterranean, the Utrecht settlement was disturbed by the Emperor of Austria, England's natural ally in the then existing state of European politics. Backed by England, he, having already Naples, claimed also Sicily in exchange for Sardinia. Spain resisted, and her navy, just beginning to revive under a vigorous minister, Alberoni, was crushed and annihilated by the English fleet off Cape Passaro in 1718; while the following year a French army, at the bidding of England, crossed the Pyrenees and completed the work by destroying the Spanish dock-yards. Thus England, in addition to Gibraltar and Mahon in her own hands, saw Naples and Sicily in those of a friend, while an enemy was struck down. In Spanish America, the limited privileges to English trade, wrung from the necessities of Spain, were abused by an extensive and scarcely disguised smuggling system; and when the exasperated Spanish government gave way to excesses in the mode of suppression, both the minister who counselled peace and the opposition which urged war defended their opinions by alleging the effects of either upon England's sea power and honor. While England's policy thus steadily aimed at widening and strengthening the basis of her sway upon the ocean, the other governments of Europe seemed blind to the dangers to be feared from her sea growth. The miseries resulting from the overweening power of Spain in days long gone by seemed to be forgotten; forgotten also the more recent lesson of the bloody and costly wars provoked by the ambition and exaggerated power of Louis XIV. Under the eyes of the statesmen of Europe there was steadily and visibly being built up a third overwhelming power, destined to be used as selfishly as aggressively, though not as cruelly, and much more successfully than any that had preceded it. This was the power of the sea, whose workings, because more silent than the clash of arms, are less often noted, though lying clearly enough on the surface. It can scarcely be denied that England's uncontrolled dominion of the seas during almost the whole period chosen for our subject was by long odds the chief among the military factors that determined the final issue. So far, however, was this influence from being foreseen after Utrecht, that France for 12 years, moved by personal exigencies of her rulers, sided with England against Spain; and when Fleury came into power in 1726, though this policy was reversed, the navy of France received no attention, and the only blow at England was the establishment of a Bourbon prince, a natural enemy to her, upon the throne of the Two Sicilies in 1736. When war broke out with Spain in 1739, the navy of England was in numbers more than equal to the combined navies of Spain and France, and during the quarter of a century of nearly uninterrupted war that followed, this numerical disproportion increased. In these wars England, at first instinctively, afterward with conscious purpose, under a government that recognized her opportunity and the possibilities of her great sea power, rapidly built up that mighty colonial empire, whose foundations were already securely laid in the characteristics of her colonists and the strength of her fleets. In strictly European affairs her wealth, the outcome of her sea power, made her play a conspicuous part during the same period. The system of subsidies, which began half a century before in the wars of Marlborough, and received its most extensive development half a century later in the Napoleonic wars, maintained the efforts of her allies, which would have been crippled, if not paralyzed, without them. Who can deny that the government which, with one hand, strengthened its fainting allies on the continent with the lifeblood of money, and with the other drove its own enemies off the sea and out of their chief possessions, Canada, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Havana, Manila, gave to its country the foremost rôle in European politics? And who can fail to see that the power which dwelt in that government, with a land narrow in extent and poor in resources, sprang directly from the sea? The policy in which the English government carried on the war is shown by a speech of Pitt, the master spirit during its course, though he lost office before bringing it to an end. Condemning the peace of 1763, made by his political opponent, he said, "France is chiefly, if not exclusively, formidable to us as a maritime and commercial power. What we gain in this respect is valuable to us, above all, through the injury to her which results from it. You have left to France the possibility of reviving her navy. Yet England's gains were enormous. Her rule in India was assured, and all North America east of the Mississippi in her hands. By this time the onward path of her government was clearly marked out, had assumed the force of a tradition, and was consistently followed. The War of the American Revolution was, it is true, a great mistake, looked at from the point of view of sea power; but the government was led into it insensibly by a series of natural blunders. Putting aside political and constitutional considerations, and looking at the question as purely military or naval, the case was this: the American colonies were large and growing communities at a great distance from England. So long as they remained attached to the mother country, as they then were enthusiastically, they formed a solid base for her sea power in that part of the world. but their extent and population were too great, when coupled with the distance from England, to afford any hope of holding them by force, if any powerful nations were willing to help them. This if, however, involved a notorious probability. The humiliation of France and Spain was so bitter and so recent that they were sure to seek revenge, and it was well known that France in particular had been carefully and rapidly building up her navy. Had the colonies been 13 islands, the sea power of England would quickly have settled the question; but instead of such a physical barrier, they were separated only by local jealousies, which a common danger sufficiently overcame. To enter deliberately on such a contest, to try to hold by force so extensive a territory with a large hostile population so far from home, was to renew the 7 Years' War with France and Spain, and with the Americans against instead of for England. The 7 Years' War had been so heavy a burden that a wise government would have known that the added weight could not be borne, and have seen it was necessary to conciliate the colonists. The government of the day was not wise, and a large element of England's sea power was sacrificed, but by mistake, not wilfully, through arrogance, not through weakness. This steady keeping to a general line of policy was doubtless made specially easy for successive English governments by the clear indications of the country's conditions. Singleness of purpose was to some extent imposed. The firm maintenance of her sea power, the haughty determination to make it felt, the wise state of preparation in which its military element was kept, were yet more due to that feature of her political institutions which practically gave the government, during the period in question, into the hands of a class, a landed aristocracy. Such a class, whatever its defects otherwise, readily takes up and carries on a sound political tradition, is naturally proud of its country's glory, and comparatively insensible to the sufferings of the community by which that glory is maintained. It readily lays on the pecuniary burden necessary for preparation and for endurance of war. Being as a body rich, it feels those burdens less. Not being commercial, the sources of its own wealth are not so immediately endangered, and it does not share that political timidity which characterizes those whose property is exposed and business threatened, the proverbial timidity of capital. Yet in England this class was not insensible to anything that touched her trade for good or ill. Both Houses of Parliament vied in careful watchfulness over its extension and protection, and to the frequency of their inquiries a naval historian attributes the increased deficiency of the executive power in its management of the navy. Such a class also naturally imbibes and keeps up a spirit of military honor, which is of the first importance in ages when military institutions have not yet provided the sufficient substitute in what is called esprit de corps. But although full of class feeling and class prejudice, which made themselves felt in the navy as well as elsewhere, their practical sense left open the way of promotion to its highest honors to the more humbly born; and every age saw admirals who had sprung from the lowest of the people. In this the temper of the English upper class differed markedly from that of the French. As late as 1789, at the outbreak of the Revolution, the French navy list still bore the name of an official whose duty was to verify the proofs of noble birth on the part of those intending to enter the naval school. Since 1815, and especially in our own day, the government of England has passed very much more into the hands of the people at large. Whether her sea power will suffer therefrom remains to be seen. Its broad basis still remains in a great trade, large mechanical industries, and an extensive colonial system. Whether a democratic government will have the foresight, the keen sensitiveness to national position and credit, the willingness to insure its prosperity by adequate outpouring of money in times of peace, all which are necessary for military preparation, is yet an open question. Popular governments are not generally favorable to military expenditure, however necessary, and there are signs that England tends to drop behind. It has already been seen that the Dutch Republic even more than the English nation, drew its prosperity and its very life from the sea. The character and policy of its government were far less favorable to a consistent support of sea power. Composed of 7 provinces, with the political name of the United Provinces, the actual distribution of power may be roughly described to Americans as an exaggerated example of states' rights. Each of the maritime provinces had its own fleet and its own admiralty, with consequent jealousies. This disorganizing tendency was partly counteracted by the great preponderance of the province of Holland, which alone contributed 5/6 of the fleet and 58% of the taxes, and consequently had a proportionate share in directing the national policy. Although intensely patriotic and capable of making the last sacrifices for freedom, the commercial spirit of the people penetrated the government, which indeed might be called a commercial aristocracy, and made it averse to war and to the expenditures which are necessary in preparing for war. As has before been said, it was not until danger stared them in the face that the burgomasters were willing to pay for their defences. While the republican government lasted, however, this economy was practised least of all upon the fleet; and until the death of John de Witt in 1672 and the peace with England in 1674, the Dutch navy was in point of numbers and equipment able to make a fair show against the combined navies of England and France. Its efficiency at this time undoubtedly saved the country from the destruction planned by the two kings. With De Witt's death the republic passed away, and was followed by the practically monarchical government of William of Orange. The lifelong policy of this prince, then only 18, was resistance to Louis XIV. And to the extension of French power. This resistance took shape upon the land rather than the sea, a tendency promoted by England's withdrawal from the war. As early as 1676, Admiral de Ruyter found the force given him unequal to cope with the French alone. With the eyes of the government fixed on the land frontier, the navy rapidly declined. In 1688, when William of Orange needed a fleet to convoy him to England, the burgomasters of Amsterdam objected that the navy was incalculably decreased in strength, as well as deprived of its ablest commanders. When King of England, William still kept his position as stadtholder, and with it his general European policy. He found in England the sea power he needed, and used the resources of Holland for the land war. This Dutch prince consented that in the allied fleets, in councils of war, the Dutch admiral should sit below the junior English captain, and Dutch interests at sea were sacrificed as readily as Dutch pride to the demands of England. When William died, his policy was still followed by the government which succeeded him. Its aims were wholly centred upon the land, and at the Peace of Utrecht, which closed a series of wars extending over 40 years, Holland, having established no sea claim, gained nothing in the way of sea resources, of colonial extension, or of commerce. Of the last of these wars, an English historian says, "The economy of the Dutch greatly hurt their reputation and their trade. Their men of war in the Mediterranean were always victuals short, and their convoys were so weak and ill provided that for one ship that we lost, they lost 5, which begat a general notion that we were the safer carriers, which certainly had a good effect. Hence it was that our trade rather increased than diminished in this war." From that time Holland ceased to have a great sea power, and rapidly lost the leading position among the nations which that power had built up. It is only just to say that no policy could have saved from decline this small though determined nation in face of the persistent enmity of Louis XIV. The friendship of France, ensuring peace on her landward frontier, would have enabled her, at least for a longer time, to dispute with England the dominion of the seas, and as allies the navies of the two continental states might have checked the growth of the enormous sea power which has just been considered. Sea peace between England and Holland was only possible by the virtual subjection of one or the other, for both aimed at the same object. Between France and Holland it was otherwise, and the fall of Holland proceeded not necessarily from her inferior size and numbers, but from faulty policy on the part of the two governments. It does not concern us to decide which was the more to blame. France, admirably situated for the possession of sea power, received a definite policy for the guidance of her government from two great rulers, Henry IV. And Richelieu. With certain well-defined projects of extension eastward upon the land were combined a steady resistance to the House of Austria, which then ruled in both Austria and Spain, and an equal purpose of resistance to England upon the sea. To further this latter end, as well as for other reasons, Holland was to be courted as an ally. Commerce and fisheries as the basis of sea power were to be encouraged, and a military navy was to be built up. Richelieu left what he called his political will, in which he pointed out the opportunities of France for achieving sea power based upon her position and resources, and French writers consider him the virtual founder of the navy, not merely because he equipped ships, but from the breadth of his views and his measures to ensure sound institutions and steady growth. After his death, Mazarin inherited his views and general policy, but not his lofty and martial spirit, and during his rule the newly formed navy disappeared. When Louis XIV. Took the government into his own hands in 1661, there were but 30 ships of war, of which only 3 had as many as 60 guns. Then began a most astonishing manifestation of the work which can be done by absolute government ably and systematically wielded. That part of the administration which dealt with trade, manufactures, shipping, and colonies was given to a man of great practical genius, Colbert, who had served with Richelieu and had drunk in fully his ideas and policy. He pursued his aims in a spirit thoroughly French. Everything was to be organized; the spring of everything was in the minister's cabinet. To organize producers and merchants as a powerful army subjected to an active and intelligent guidance, so as to secure an industrial victory over France by order and unity of efforts, and to obtain the best products by imposing on all workmen the processes recognized as best by competent men. To organize seamen and distant commerce in large bodies, like the manufactures and internal commerce, and to give as a support to the commercial power of France a navy established on a firm basis and of dimensions hitherto unknown. Such, we are told, were the aims of Colbert as regards 2 of the 3 links in the chain of sea power. For the third, the colonies at the far end of the line, the same governmental direction and organization were evidently proposed. For the government began by buying back Canada, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the French West India Islands from the parties who then owned them. Here then is seen pure, absolute, uncontrolled power, gathering up into its hands all the reins for the guidance of a nation's course, and proposing so to direct it as to make, among other things, a great sea power. To enter into the details of Colbert's action is beyond our purpose. It is enough to note the chief part played by the government in building up the sea power of the state, and that this very great man looked not to any one of the bases on which it rests to the exclusion of the others, but embraced them all in his wise and provident administration. Agriculture, which increases the products of the earth, and manufactures, which multiply the products of man's industry; internal trade routes and regulations, by which the exchange of products from the interior to the exterior is made easier; shipping and customs regulations tending to throw the carrying trade into French hands, and so to encourage the building of French shipping, by which the home and colonial products should be carried back and forth; colonial administration and development, by which a far-off market might be continually growing up to be monopolized by the home trade; treaties with foreign states favoring French trade; and imposts on foreign ships and products, tending to break down that of rival nations. All these means, embracing countless details, were employed to build up for France: 1. Production; 2. Shipping; 3. Colonies and markets; in a word, sea power. The study of such a work is simpler and easier when thus done by one man, sketched out by a kind of logical process, than when slowly wrought by conflicting interests in a more complex government. In the few years of Colbert's administration is seen the whole theory of sea power, put into practice in the systematic centralizing French way, while the illustration of the same theory in English and Dutch history is spread over generations. Such growth, however, was forced, and depended upon the endurance of the absolute power which watched over it. And as Colbert was not king, his control lasted only till he lost the king's favor. It is, however, most interesting to note the results of his labors in the proper field for governmental action, in the navy. It has been said that in 1661, when he took office, there were but 30 armed ships, of which 3 only had over 60 guns. In 1666 there were 70, of which 50 were ships of the line and 20 were fire ships. In 1671, from 70 the number had increased to 196. In 1683 there were 107 ships of from 24 to 120 guns, 12 of which carried over 76 guns, besides many smaller vessels. The order and system introduced into the dockyards made them vastly more efficient than the English. An English captain, a prisoner in France, while the effect of Colbert's work still lasted in the hands of his son, writes: "When I was first brought prisoner thither, I lay 4 months in a hospital at Brest for care of my wounds. While there, I was astonished at the expedition used in manning and fitting out their ships, which till then I thought could be done nowhere sooner than in England, where we have 10 times the shipping, and consequently 10 times the seamen, they have in France. But there I saw 20 sail of ships of about 60 guns each, got ready in 20 days' time. They were brought in, and the men were discharged, and upon an order from Paris they were careened, keeled up, rigged, victualled, manned, and out again in the said time with the greatest ease imaginable. I likewise saw a ship of 100 guns that had all her guns taken out in 4 or 5 hours' time, which I never saw done in England in 24 hours, and this was the greatest ease and less hazard than at home. This I saw under my hospital window." A French naval historian cites certain performances which are simply incredible, such as that the keel of a galley was laid at 4 o'clock, and that at 9 she left port fully armed. These traditions may be accepted as pointing, with the more serious statements of the English officer, to a remarkable degree of system and order, and abundant facilities for work. Yet all this wonderful growth, forced by the action of the government, withered away like Jonah's gourd when the government's favor was withdrawn. Time was not allowed for its roots to strike down deep into the life of the nation. Colbert's work was in the direct line of Richelieu's policy, and for a time it seemed there would continue the course of action which would make France great upon the sea as well as predominant upon the land. For reasons which it is not yet necessary to give, Louis came to have feelings of bitter enmity against Holland, and as these feelings were shared by Charles II., the two kings determined on the destruction of the United Provinces. This war, which broke out in 1672, though more contrary to natural feeling on the part of England, was less of a political mistake for her than for France, and especially as regards sea power. France was helping to destroy a probable and certainly an indispensable ally. England was assisting in the ruin of her greatest rival on the sea, at this time indeed still her commercial superior. France, staggering under debt and utter confusion in her finances when Louis mounted the throne, was just seeing her way clear in 1672 under Colbert's reforms and their happy results. The war, lasting 6 years, undid the greater part of his work. The agricultural classes, manufactures, commerce, and the colonies all were smitten by it. The establishments of Colbert languished, and the order he had established in the finances was overthrown. Thus the action of Louis, and he alone was the directing government of France, struck at the roots of her sea power and alienated her best sea ally. The territory and the military power of France were increased, but the springs of commerce and of a peaceful shipping had been exhausted in the process. And although the military navy was for some years kept up with splendor and efficiency, it soon began to dwindle, and by the end of the reign had practically disappeared. The same false policy as regards the sea marked the rest of this reign of 54 years. Louis steadily turned his back upon the sea interests of France, except the fighting ships, and either could not or would not see that the latter were of little use and uncertain life if the peaceful shipping and the industries by which they were supported perished. His policy, aiming at supreme power in Europe by military strength and territorial extension, forced England and Holland into an alliance which, as has before been said, directly drove France off the sea and indirectly swamped Holland's power thereon. Colbert's navy perished, and for the last 10 years of Louis's life no great French fleet put to sea, though there was constant war. The simplicity of form in an absolute monarchy thus brought out strongly how great the influence of government can be upon both the growth and the decay of sea power. Chapter 1, Part 3.